Hi everyone, today I'm going to tell you the one true story. Please support me by liking and subscribing. Thanks, are you ready? Here we go. There was a small town tucked away in the deep woods of Pinehill Hollow, where the trees seemed to grow darker and taller than anywhere else. The air was thick with secrets and whispers, as if the very land itself kept a watchful eye on its inhabitants. The locals spoke in hushed tones, warning strangers not to venture too far past the old mill or through the abandoned fields at the edge of the woods, where the shadows grew long and the path seemed to twist on its own accord. It was a chilly autumn evening when four friends decided to visit their classmate, Emily, who had recently moved to the outskirts of Pinehill Hollow. The group, eager for a weekend getaway and unaware of the town's chilling reputation, made their way to Emily's family farm, an old, creaky house surrounded by towering oaks and overgrown hedges. "I heard there's a witch that lives out here," said Sarah, glancing around as the wind rustled the branches above them. "That's just an old story," laughed Mark, nudging her. "Witches don't live in the real world. I bet they're just a bunch of spooky tales to scare kids." But as they approached Emily's house, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder, as if something was watching them from the shadows. Emily greeted them with a nervous smile, her eyes darting to the woods in the distance. "Come inside," she said, her voice quivering slightly. "I'll show you around." The inside of the house was no better. It had that eerie, musty smell of old wood and damp stone, and the walls were lined with faded photographs and strange trinkets, things that felt out of place. A large, ornate mirror hung above the fireplace, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The kind of mirror you might expect in an old haunted mansion. Emily quickly led them upstairs to her room, but as she passed a small wooden door at the end of the hall, she hesitated. "That's the attic," she said, her voice growing quieter. You shouldn't go up there. My mom always says it's not safe." "Not safe? What, like it's haunted or something?" Mark teased, raising an eyebrow. Emily stiffened. "No, It's not what you think." But before anyone could ask more, the lights flickered and a loud bang echoed from upstairs. Sarah screamed, startled. Emily's eyes widened, her hands trembling. "I think we should go outside," she said quickly. "It's better if we stay in the yard tonight." The group, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house, followed Emily outside. The wind had picked up, and the trees whispered in a language that seemed foreign, ancient. The moon, full and eerie, hung like a lantern in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. As they walked through the yard, the rustling leaves began to take on a more sinister tone, as though they were being watched by unseen eyes. Emily led them to a small clearing near the woods. "This is the place where it happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Where what happened?" asked Ben, who had been silent up until now. "The witch," Emily replied, her face pale. "My family has lived here for generations. There's always been talk of her. A woman who lives deep in the woods. They say she made a deal with the devil, that she's cursed this land." The group laughed nervously, but there was a chill in the air that none of them could shake off. Emily's expression grew more serious. "They say the witch can control the wind, the trees. She can make things happen. Things that shouldn't be possible." Her voice dropped to a near whisper, and for a moment, the wind seemed to stop. The clearing grew unnaturally still, as if waiting for something. Suddenly, a distant howl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down their spines. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. Emily's face went white. That's not a wolf. It's her. She's near." The group turned to see the woods at the edge of the clearing shift, the trees bending in unnatural directions, as if a storm was brewing inside the forest itself. The air grew thick with tension. Then it happened. A figure emerged from the shadows. A woman, draped in black robes, with wild, untamed hair. Her face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through their very souls. She stood motionless at the edge of the clearing, her presence both frightening and magnetic. Emily gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "She's here." The witch's lips curled into a twisted smile. Her voice echoed through the trees, a voice that was not quite human, yet not entirely foreign. "You should not have come here," she said, her voice reverberating through the ground. "You trespass on sacred land." A cold breeze swept through the clearing, and the trees began to sway violently. The group huddled together, terror in their eyes, as they watched the witch step closer, her feet barely touching the ground. Her eyes were locked onto Emily, and the air grew colder still. "Leave her be," Emily cried, her voice trembling. "Please, don't hurt them." The witch's eyes flashed, and she let out a laugh that sent chills down their spines. "You think you can save them?" she hissed. "The curse runs deep in your blood. You belong to me, child." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shifted, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees twisted, their branches contorting into shapes that resembled hands reaching for them. Ben screamed as he felt something cold wrap around his ankle, dragging him toward the woods. "Help!" Ben shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the wind howling louder than ever. The witch moved with unnatural speed, her hands outstretched, and before they knew it, Ben was gone, his screams fading into the distance. The remaining friends could only watch in horror as the witch vanished back into the shadows, her laughter echoing through the trees. "She's gone," Emily whispered, her face stricken with guilt. "She's taken him. What do we do now?" Sarah whispered, trembling. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with fear. "We run. We leave before she comes back." They didn't need any more convincing. They fled the clearing, running through the woods as fast as they could, the witch's presence hanging over them like a dark cloud. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't escape the feeling that the woods were alive. Alive with malevolent intent, watching their every move. And as they stumbled into the safety of the town, they could hear it, the distant, echoing howl of the witch, still waiting in the woods, still hungry for more souls to claim. No one in Pinehill Hollow ever spoke of that night again. The town's shadows grew longer, the trees grew taller, and the whispers grew louder. And somewhere, deep in the heart of those cursed woods, the witch still waited, still hungry, still watching. And the land she cursed? It never forgot. The town of Pinehill Hollow was eerily quiet in the days that followed the disappearance of Ben. Emily, Sarah, and Mark had returned to their homes, their hearts weighed down by the horror they had witnessed. The oppressive atmosphere of the woods seemed to follow them, lingering in the corners of their minds. Every creak of floorboards, every shadow in their homes, felt like the witch's cold, unforgiving eyes were still upon them. But the nightmares did not end. It was late one evening, days after the horrific encounter, when Mark received a text from Emily. "We need to talk. Come to my house. Now." He didn't think twice. Something about the urgency in her message pulled at him, a feeling deep in his gut telling him that they weren't done with the witch. She hadn't finished with them yet. The wind howled as he made his way down the winding road to Emily's house, and the forest, as it had been since that fateful night, loomed ominously at the edge of the property. Emily was pacing when Mark arrived. She looked pale, her eyes wide with panic, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She didn't even look up when he entered. "Emily?" Mark called softly. She whirled around, her face contorted with fear. "It's happening again," she gasped. "She's here." Before Mark could react, the door slammed shut behind him, the air inside the house growing thick with dread. The room suddenly felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in. "I thought it was over," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought if we just stayed away from the woods. But she's not going to let us go. She wants us all." Suddenly there was a loud, hollow knock on the door, one, then two, then three in rapid succession, like someone was trying to get in. The knocking continued, frantic now, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Mark's heart thudded in his chest. The knocking grew louder, and suddenly, the air grew colder still. A gust of wind howled through the house, extinguishing the candles, plunging them into darkness. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps from upstairs, slow, deliberate, heavy. began to descend the creaking stairs. Emily's breath hitched. "She's here," she whispered again, barely audible. Her voice cracked with the weight of the truth. They backed away from the door, and just as the footsteps reached the landing, the room seemed to shudder. The floorboards groaned under the weight of an unseen force, and the temperature dropped so sharply that they could see their breath in the air. Without warning, the door burst open with an unnatural force. The witch stood in the doorway, her figure towering and skeletal, her hair whipping around her face in a wild frenzy. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull everything around them into their depths. She stood silent, staring at them as if savoring the fear in their hearts. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The witch slowly raised her hand, her fingers elongating into sharp, bony claws, her fingers curling as if preparing to tear the very air apart. A sickly, raspy laugh spilled from her lips, a sound that filled the room with an almost physical pain. "You think you can run from me?" she crooned, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You cannot escape the curse. It is in your blood, child. And now, I take what is mine." With a chilling speed, the witch lunged toward Emily, her clawed hand striking out and slashing across her throat. Blood sprayed across the walls as Emily fell to the floor, gasping for breath, her hands clutching the wound. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream as life drained from her body. Mark stumbled back, a scream clawing at his throat, but he couldn't move. It was as if the witch's presence had frozen him in place. All he could do was watch, paralyzed, as Emily's body convulsed on the floor, her once bright eyes now glazed with the dull sheen of death. "No!" Mark cried, shaking, his voice barely audible over the witch's wicked laughter. "Stop! Please stop!" But the witch paid him no mind. She turned, her eyes locking onto him, and in that instant, the room seemed to darken, the walls closing in around him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Every step was like wading through tar, his body heavy, his limbs stiff. The witch's hand shot out like a spear, grasping him by the throat and lifting him off the ground. "You should have never come here," she whispered in his ear, her breath like ice against his skin. "This is my land, my curse, and now you are mine." In one swift motion, the witch's claws pierced through Mark's chest, tearing into his heart with brutal force. Blood poured from the wound, hot and thick, spilling over the floor as Mark's body went limp in her grasp. His lifeless eyes stared out, unblinking, as the witch dropped him to the floor like a rag doll. Mark's death was swift, yet agonizing. His final scream had died in his throat, choked off by the suffocating presence of the witch. The witch stood over them, her eyes still burning with cold malevolence. She glanced at Sarah, who was paralyzed with fear in the corner of the room. She knew deep down that she would be next, but Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't run. The witch's voice was like a whisper in the dead silence. "Your friends are gone," she said softly, her form now shifting in the dim light. "They are mine. And now, so are you." The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness consumed her was the witch's face, her twisted grin stretching unnaturally wide, as the world faded to black. The next morning, the house was silent. The wind had died down, but the air felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of what had happened. The door to the house stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze, but the inside was empty. No one had come to claim the bodies. The rooms were dark and cold, the eerie silence palpable. The locals, who had long whispered about the curse of Pinehill Hollow, knew the truth now. The witch had claimed her prize, and there was nothing left but the hollow, the land soaked in the blood of the innocent, and the trees that would never forget. As for the witch, she remained in the woods, waiting patiently for the next unlucky souls to trespass into her domain. And Pinehill Hollow? It stood, as it always had, on the edge of the forest, dark, forgotten, and forever cursed. Thank you for watching. Please support me and meet me in another video.